Rock Chat with Trace.
This podcast I'm talking to Brandon Fields, who has recently formed a new band called Minefield. Hello Brandon, and thank you for doing the podcast.
Thank you for having me on. Glad to be here.
How did you first get into music and playing guitar?
Well, my dad growing up, he was in bands and everything, so I was kind of exposed to it from a young age. So it was almost, I tell people I had a choice, but I didn't have a choice, you know? So it was all very captivating to see a live rock band at such a young age. So it's very enthralling, and, that kind of inspired me to lead my own path as well.
What is your favourite guitar?
Well, I'm also in a Guns N' Roses tribute band that I play Slash in, so I really love the Appetite for Destruction Les Paul. Just the finish on that is beautiful in my opinion. I love it so much.
Who are your influences?
Guns N' Roses and Kiss would probably be my two biggest influences if I had to narrow it down, which I think is what makes this band so interesting for me, is that with Slash and Ace Frehley being my two favorite guitarists, I now have a band that literally only consists of members of their bands. So it's very humbling and an awesome feeling for me to be able to say my band consists of members of my two favorite guitarist bands. So it adds a whole other element of excitement to it for me.
What is so special about them?
Well, Kiss, I think, is just, they separate themselves entirely from just everything else a band would typically do. They set a different path as far as what you could be doing with your brand and everything else, not just typically with the music. They kind of set the forefront with the stage show and all that stuff. So they kind of helped add to, the kind of rock star element that's outside of the band. And then Guns N' Roses, that's just hardcore, straight rock and roll, and you just can't beat that stuff to me. And so if I had to narrow it down, those are my two biggest influences.
What is your favourite Guns N' Roses album and why?
Well, I know it sounds very typical, but I got to go with Appetite for Destruction. So to me, that's just, I know I have a biased opinion because I'm in a GNR tribute band and I work with Todd and all this stuff, but that whole album is just, from top to bottom, just some really solid rock and roll. And I think that you can't really call yourself a fan of rock and roll and ignore the impact that album has had in rock and roll in general. So even if you don't like the music, that album is, I think that's it's the highest selling debut album of all time. I mean, they came right out of the gate and were ready to take over the world. But even though that album, it took about a year for anybody to even grab onto it, I think that's inspiring in itself, that, just because you don't find immediate success doesn't mean you won't, because GNR ended up turning into the biggest band in the world for a few years, even though Appetite for Destruction was out for almost a whole year before it even caught on anywhere.
What's the history behind the Brandon Fields experience?
So in late 2015, I put out my first solo acoustic EP, and I was just touring around under Brandon Field. When it came time to do a follow-up to that, I wanted to do a full band album, not just the me and acoustic thing. I ended up cutting this entire album, and we needed a name for it. It was just me and a drummer, and I played guitar, bass, and did all the vocals on it. And so we ended up going with Brandon Fields' Experience name for that album, and I still use that name today for my three-piece solo band whenever we go out and play. And so that's typically where that started, was me transitioning from the solo to the more band aspect early on in my career.
You released 2 solo albums as the Brandon Fields Experience. Can you tell me more about them?
So the last one would be the one I would consider the most professionally done album. We were in a really nice studio here in Lexington, and it was all of us playing live together. We had another guitarist on the album, Dustin Witt, who still plays with my band today. So it was me and him playing guitar with the drummer live in the studio. So all those tracks on the last album, Out of This World, that came out in 2018, all those were done with no click track, us literally just jamming them out in the studio. And that's something I really like to replicate on the audio recordings, to where it kind of gives it a more authentic feel.
I believe this was initially your 3rd solo album. How did the line-up for Minefield come about?
Well, when I started cutting the demos for this album, my original plan, like you said, was for it to be a follow-up to my last solo album that came out 2 years ago. And I wanted to think of a way that I could kind of expand my demographic. And I figured what better way to do that than to play with a bunch of different musicians. And so originally, when I reached out to Todd and Jeremy and Matt, they were all just going to be doing a guest appearance on one or at the most two songs. And it was going to include some other people that I eventually just never ended up reaching out to because the four of us were, everything was just going so well with us cutting the album that it kind of just made sense to keep it going the way it was with all of us. And, it turned from those guys just doing a guest appearance to us signing a record deal with Golden Robot Records, and now we've got a 10-song album coming out through them. So it just kind of all snowball effect from reaching out for that first guest appearance.
How did signing for Golden Robot Records happen?
I was kind of weighing the options when everything first started happening about realistically what would be the best route to go as far as releasing it. And, I looked into releasing it on my own and hiring some publicists to handle the PR and all that stuff. And, just kind of started tossing around the idea of reaching out to some record labels. And Golden Robot was actually the first one that I reached out to, ironically, and ended up having a couple different meetings with Mark, the CEO, and, everything just kind of seemed to fall in place, and it just made sense for us to work with each other. I kind of think of it like I think of the album like a food truck. You want to park it at the spot in town where you're going to get the most business. So that's kind of what I wanted to do with the album. I wanted to take it to where I think that it's going to get the best reception, and I think that us working together as a team is going to make for a really successful release.
How did you come up with the name Minefield?
So that was kind of a push from the record label to go with more of a band name instead of just releasing it under another solo album for me. And because it did make more sense because all four of us are on all 10 tracks, so it was more of a band situation than it was just me having these guys play on songs I wrote. We ended up going with a couple different names and tossing them around, and I actually submitted a different name to the record label, and everything was supposed to be done, and the whole next day I just kept thinking of that name, and it just kept hitting my ear weird. I didn't like it, and the next morning I woke up and the name Minefield just came to me almost instantaneous from waking up, and I texted the guys and they were like, yeah, I think that's a great name. So I ended up having to reach out to Golden Robot and be like, hey, that name I gave you yesterday, we're gonna have to go back and change it because we're not using that now. So, but luckily those guys are all super nice to work with and everything, so it wasn't a big ordeal. But it was definitely more of a push from the record label to go with more of a band name once it kind of finalized into the situation it did, and it was for the best.
The first single is Alone Together. Can you describe it?
It's very hard rock. So I think the contrastal difference from the first and second single is going to be great because you've got Alone Together, which is a very up-tempo hard rock song, and the second song is a little more mellow. It's more epic. It's got parts where it builds up and comes back down. Lots of harmonies, lots of Queen influence in this song. So I think the contrastal difference from both is going to be pretty exciting. But Alone Together, that riff for that song is actually a really old riff that I probably wrote when I was about 16 or 17 that I've just never used on anything. The rest of the song was new, but that main riff is something that I've had in my repertoire for going on 8 or 9 years. I just never used it for myself, and thankfully I didn't, because it turned out to be a better song than I feel like I could have written on my own, because Todd's vocals on that song are just amazing.
The next single, I believe, is Home. What can we expect from it, and when will it come out?
Well, like I said, this one's a little more epic. It's personally, and I think if you asked all of us, this is probably our favorite song on the entire record. So this is one that I am super excited for everybody to hear it, and get some reception on it. So with it being all of our favorite track, it kind of adds a whole other element of excitement for us to it.
What would you say is the sound of the album?
Going back to the influence I listed off, with Kiss and Guns N' Roses being my favorite band, you definitely hear aspects of all of that. And you got to think Todd's been playing with Slash for the last 10 years. Jeremy and Matt are both with Ace. So, I mean, these influences are all very strongly heard on the album, and that's that's kind of the beauty of it, is that there's really no pressure to make it sound like a certain thing. It's all of us just kind of comfortably doing our own thing.
How did the lyrics and riffs come about?
Well, I would say for the entire album, 75% of the music I wrote and had presented to those guys. So, but all the songs that each of us sing, there's 10 songs on the album. Todd sings 6 or 7 of them. I sing 2 and Jeremy sings 1. With the exception of one of the songs I'm singing on, we all wrote our own lyrics and melodies. So a lot of the music was the heavy lifting for that was done by me. But as far as the vocals and the melodies go, we each wrote our own whenever it came to stuff that we were singing.
You have a couple of guests on the album. How did that happen?
So Jeremy was the first one that I reached out to when all of this started. I've known Jeremy since I was about 13 years old. And, you know, he got the gig with Ace and we kind of reconnected a little because I'd go watch him play and hang out with him whenever they'd come around town to Kentucky. And so it started with Jeremy. And then I was talking to him and I was like, hey, man, do you think it'd be worth reaching out to Matt Starr to see if he'd be interested in playing on a song? And I ended up reaching out to Matt. And then after that, I ended up reaching out to Todd. And like I said, originally, these guys were just going to be doing 1 or 2 songs a piece. And then it turned into all that. Now, we do have 2 more guests on the album. Well, 3 actually now. We haven't announced the 3rd one yet. So I'll go ahead and give that to you. But there's a track on the album titled Lady Danger, which features Alex Kane from Enough's Enough and Eric Jake from Wild Street, who actually just signed to Golden Robot as well. I definitely recommend checking those guys out. Very 80s sleaze rock. So in the song that these guys guest on, it fits right in that Enough's Enough and Wild Street style. So, and then actually now we have Zach Throne from Corey Taylor's band and Bruce Kulick's band is going to be doing some background vocals on one of the final originals that we're recording right now. Other than that, those 3 guys on those 2 songs, the rest of the album is consistently the 4 of us through the entire thing.
Did the band self-produce the album?
Yeah, so from where it was all recorded remotely, we all kind of handled it ourselves, recording at our own places. Me and Jeremy cut our guitars at our own home studios, and then Matt was out in Los Angeles, and he actually had a producer named John Smith who was cutting his drums for him for a majority of the album. I know he cut 1 or 2 songs up in Connecticut. You'll have to forgive me because I don't know the producer's name that he's working with up there. But Todd was out in Vegas working with Jimmy Romero, who's in a band called the Hellenbacks, and he does a lot of production. He actually did the production for Bruce Kulick's guest appearance on the new Ace Frehley record. And Jimmy is also the one who is putting together our full music video for Alone Together. So we got to thank all of those guys because this is all one big moving project. So you take away one part and it kind of falls apart, you know?
The track was mixed and mastered by Anthony Fox. How did that collaboration happen?
That was a big influence from Jeremy Asbrock. So Anthony just did the new Ace Frehley Origins Volume 2 album. Jeremy had just got done working with him on that, and Anthony lives in Nashville, and he's known Jeremy for a long time as well. Anthony's got a really large repertoire of awesome stuff that he's worked on. He did a lot of the Guitar Hero stuff in the 2000s. He was in a band called Beautiful Creatures, actually, with Matt Starr. Matt Starr played drums on the second Beautiful Creatures album, which features Anthony on guitar in that band. And so whenever it came time to find somebody to do all the mixing and mastering for this stuff, Anthony was the guy that was at the top of the list when it came to recommendations from these guys. And then from just talking with Anthony, you know, me and him are kind of on the same wavelength as far as it goes, as how we think stuff should sound. And it just kind of made sense for both of us to work together.
How was it to work with him?
Anthony's a very easy guy to work with. So a lot of producers sometimes, you know, they want more control, or there's some producers that aren't as involved, but Anthony finds a really healthy mix of finding what he needs to input and still, you know, taking us into consideration as well. You know, it's a lot of teamwork going together. So we're all really well at communicating with each other. And if we think something needs to be a little different right here, Anthony's really open to going back and seeing what we can do to find a happy medium with that. So Anthony's, I got to give him a lot of thanks because, I mean, without him, it wouldn't sound as good as it does. So we can play the parts as perfectly as we can, but if the person that's mixing and mastering it doesn't do their job as well, it makes a big difference.
When is the album getting released?
It's going to be out sometime in February. We haven't announced the actual date yet, but February will be when the album comes out. And as far as the rest of the singles go, with Homecoming out on the 16th of November, there's actually going to be a pretty decent break between the second and third singles, because the way it works is distributors kind of take a break for the holidays around December. So we'll be delivering the album to Golden Robot in early December, and then first of the year is when all the production will happen as far as like getting the album printed and all that stuff. And we'll have another single out late January, early February. And then there will also be a fourth single that drops the same day as the album, which is going to be a cover of Kiss's All American Man off of Live too. Oh, I'm very excited. I think the Kiss cover might be what I'm excited about the most.
Will you have an option to tour the album?
I think that's kind of out of our control at this point. I think we're gonna have to kind of play that by ear. So hopefully by February, when springtime rolls around, everything will kind of be, a little more normal than it is right now. So that definitely had a big impact on as far as us spreading the singles out and releasing everything, because, you don't want to release an album, say right now, and then, it could be a whole year from now before you can go out on the road in support of that thing. And that's really not what we're trying to do. We want to keep our fans as interested as possible as we can through this entire process. So if we were to release the whole album right now, that'd be it. The album would be out and we'd just have the entire album to promote. But with us spreading the singles out, we can promote each single and kind of give them a little more TLC than they might normally get. So as far as touring goes, I think we're kind of in the same boat as everybody else, is waiting to see what happens with the whole global situation right now.
Is Minefield just a one album project, or are you going to make more albums?
So we have an option in our contract with Golden Robot for a second album. So I know the four of us have had a great time working together, but I think realistically what's going to play into that a lot is what our schedules look like outside of Minefield, because this isn't all of our main band, so, and not saying it could eventually one day turn into that, because you never know what can happen in life. So I think that's really going to depend on Ace Frehley's schedule and Slash's schedule with Todd. So we'll kind of play that by ear whenever it comes to it. We don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves right now, but we've had a great time working together, and I would totally be open to doing another album. I can't speak for the other three guys, but a second album would be great in my book.
Can you tell me about your podcast, Fields and Friends?
Everybody's just kind of been, as you know, stuck in their house, and we can't really actually hang out in person right now. So one thing I've always enjoyed is, just talking good music that I enjoy with my friends. And, I've watched some other people do similar stuff that I enjoy listening to. And, I found some subjects that I thought could be pretty entertaining. It's a newer thing. So like I said, whenever we were shooting the first episode, we didn't know it was going to be the first episode. And I actually got some really good feedback from that. And, it was a lot of fun. And it's not necessarily something where I'm worried if I get 5,000 or 10,000 streams on an episode. If I can just have an excuse to make my friends hang out with me on Zoom for an hour or two and talk about some of my favorite bands, that's a winning situation for me. It's definitely something that I think I'm going to take advantage of now with all this free time that I've got, that I wish I would have started months ago when all this started, and I was just kind of sitting around the house twiddling my thumbs for a few months. So I'm pretty excited about this. It's definitely a little out of my normal comfort zone doing something like that. So it's pretty exciting, and I look forward to some of the stuff that we've got planned with that.
Anything else you want to mention?
I guess the only thing I can tell people right now is go check out the first two singles. What's Home will be out the 16th of November, and it's on Spotify, anywhere else that you get your music from, Amazon, iTunes Store, Apple Music, all that good stuff. So go follow Minefield on all of our social media, Minefield USA, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and then all of our personal pages. Go give us a like on those. So we're looking forward to getting all this stuff out there and letting everybody hear it.
Minefield's latest single, Home, came out on the 16th of November 2020, and I'd like to thank Brandon for coming on Rock Chat with Trace.
Thank you for having me on. That was very fun.